As a class, we recently went to visit a company called Wesgro. Wesgro aims to bring investment to South Africa and more specifically Cape Town and Western Cape. We had the pleasure of meeting with Cornelius, who is the Chief Research Officer for Wesgro. He gave a short presentation on Wesgro and what they do as a company, and then gave a larger presentation on discussing the economic environment of Western Cape and really the whole of South Africa. We learned a lot about the potential of Western Cape and some of its successes that got it to where it is now, which would be the 12th largest market in all of Africa. We also learned about Western Cape's struggles, such as the 8 recessions since 1961 and the growing wealth gap. Overall, Cornelius helped paint a picture of Western Cape and South Africa that we can now use for analysis and tie back to our course. The first thing I want to dive into is the international trade trends we saw highlighted in Cornelius's presentation. The 2 ways I want to approach this is 1, by looking at some of the global trends we have seen of late and look how it has affected South Africa and how it could affect the future of South Africa. The second thing I want to look at is what South Africa has been doing in the international market and provide some commentary on that. The 2 global trends I want to look further into is the growth in Africa and the shift from globalization in Western Europe and the US. To start with the growth in Africa, Africa as a whole has seen tremendous growth in the past decade, especially in places such as East Africa. Additionally, the entire population of Africa is supposed to double in 30 years. So what does this mean for South Africa? Well, the reviews are mixed. South Africa has seen small economic growth during this same period of massive growth for the whole of Africa. Their growth has averaged about 1.5% over the last decade, which is less than inflation. However, I do think this trend can strategically help South Africa in the future. One of the big reasons for the differences in growth between South Africa and the rest of the continent is because South Africa has a much bigger base than most. What I mean by this is that the other countries have smaller economic foundations. For example, it is much easier for a country with an economic base of 5 to jump to 10 than, say, a country with a base of 100 to jump to 200. However, I think in the long run, the development of South Africa's neighboring countries will boost its economy. Think of a developed country like the US. They still do 30% of their trade with the other North American countries, or the EU, who all trade with each other. So I think with many growing economies around South Africa and the growing demand in Africa due to population growth, South Africa is in an advantageous position for the future. Okay, so that was one trend and its influence on South Africa. I'm now going to transition into the second trend I want to look at. It has to do with the increasing push away from globalization. We have examples such as Brexit, the China-American trade war, and the list seems to keep expanding. I am not trying to argue that the global economy is shifting away from globalization. However, I want to highlight something I think could be a serious threat to the development of South Africa and the rest of Africa. As I talked about earlier, Africa is currently seeing great amounts of economic growth. The growth in the continent is largely based on the idea of diversification. This is a great strategic approach to positive economic growth and development. Coupled with the idea of diversification, Africa has been very pro-globalization. I would say it is very dependent on globalization for its continued growth. Africa's domestic markets are not very strong and will need a lot more development before they can adopt an approach like the US or the UK. I think this is why South Africa, and even more so the whole of Africa, is very vulnerable to shifts in globalization. They are in that stage of development where they are leaning on those international trade networks to grow. One caveat is I think that out of all the countries in Africa, South Africa would be the least affected by a decline in globalization since it already has a built-up economic foundation than other African countries. However, you may also recall that I believe a lot of South Africa's future development is dependent on its neighboring countries, which this decline in globalization would affect. Concluding my point, I think this trend will be a big thing to watch in the coming years and one that could dramatically change the world economy landscape. I have now addressed a few of the international influences on South Africa and some of the future environments it could be facing. To round out my presentation, I want to look at South Africa's current position in international markets and discuss what that means for South Africa in the current and future. South Africa largely exports resource-intensive products, while it imports primarily finished goods such as cars, machines, and medicine. As I've already stated, the economic growth has been low for quite a few years, and South Africa runs on a trade deficit. The country sees a very high unemployment rate, particularly high among youth unemployment. Overall, the current condition of South Africa's economy is not great. I think the two main factors that hurt South Africa are its government and its comparative advantage. The government is the hardest and easiest problem at the same time. On paper, a lot of the solutions are straightforward. Unfortunately, the policy needed to help and stimulate the economy is not what gets politicians elected. The second factor that is hurting South Africa is its comparative advantage. And when I mean hurting, this really affects the unemployment issue I touched on earlier. Primarily due to the major industries South Africa exports, it receives a lot of capital investment. However, this does not directly correlate to jobs. I think there is some promise with the growing services industry. However, this is going to be another obstacle South Africa is going to have to overcome to generate more growth and fix the unemployment problem. I have laid out a lot about the South African economy. I've discussed some strengths and weaknesses. I've also discussed some threats and opportunities. I think South Africa has a challenging road ahead, and it will be interesting to see how South Africa traverses the next decade.